been a year ago, 9 months ago, when he was in San Diego. But really wonderful to have you back joining us, co-founder of the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. And a little plug, if you haven't picked up his book yet, Wholehearted, Slow Down, Help Out, Wake Up. In case of you, any of you have any extra time on your hands right now and need something to do, it's a great time to get the book. Amazon, best place to get it right now, Koshin?
Sure, or a local book.
Or local bookshop, Buddha for you. So thank you for joining us. They're all yours. And Tom, you'll kind of moderate from here with Koshin if he needs anything. Yes, sir?
Thank you,
Awesome.
Jeff.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Koshin.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Delight to be here and to have some time to practice together. And so I thought we could begin by dropping into some formal practice, and then we'll have a short talk and time for a question and answer. So however is upright for you, let's look at how we can explore being upright in our body and mind. So taking a moment, I'm sitting, and so depending on how your back is and how your body is, you might be laying down or you might be in different positions. And so just taking a moment to come upright. And again, that might be laying down. It's more of an attitude, this uprightness. So finding how you can have your shoulders open. And just feeling with your shoulders open if there's some way that you can make your head upright also. And seeing if you can allow your chest and abdomen to be soft and almost imagining that they're transparent. So the strength of your spine keeping you upright, and the softness and receptivity of an openness. And then bringing your breath into what in Zen we call your hara, which is that place 2 inches below your belly button. And just feeling that. And so just feel the breath entering and leaving your body, but at that place 2 inches below your belly button. So just really allowing, what is that like? Just noticing what happens to your body and your mind when you bring your attention to that area, that soft area below your belly button. And allowing for some tenderness, receptivity. Welcoming what is here. So I'll ring a bell and we'll sit for a few minutes like this. We'll go from here. While you're sitting, I just really encourage you to think about someone in your life. Maybe it's someone that you know or someone you don't know, who you want to extend this practice to. I'm thinking of John Lewis's family. Loved ones. Who can you dedicate this time of practice to? So it's a wonderful way to extend out instead of this kind of self-preoccupation about how your meditation's going. I love really considering who my meditation's for, which includes me, but it's not just me. go ring the bell 3 times, and at the end, I'll ring it twice so that we know that we're done. Afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you all and happy to be back in this way, in this time, to the Dharma Bum Temple. Thanks to Jeff, community, for inviting me back. I'm just thinking so much, as maybe some of you are, of John Lewis this morning and his death, and thinking about how 55 years ago, this image of him being beaten by police when he was on one of those freedom rides was actually what inspired the change of creating the Voting Rights Act, which actually allowed some Black people to actually have the right to vote, which was only 55 years ago. And there's something about the image, his image of actually seeing him being beaten, and that actually changed people's hearts and minds. And of course, in this time, thinking about George Floyd, and I don't know how many of you have seen the image, the video of him being murdered. It's can't really ever be forgotten. And actually, in John Lewis, when talking about George Floyd, which is so interesting, and he said to speak up, to speak out, and to get into what I call good trouble is our work. And I feel like that might be exactly the instruction for really great Bodhisattva activity, which is actually what I want to talk about today. And to me, I don't know how familiar people are with Bodhisattvas, but Bodhi means awakening, and Sattva means being, so it's an awakening being. So someone like all of us might be in this vow to be awake, which is not a destination, as some of us may have that idea. At least in the Zen tradition, we think of it as moment by moment. Like, oh, I'm waking up and I'm falling back into delusion moment by moment. And a Bodhisattva is someone who makes this vow to be of service to others. So like in our meditation practice, I encourage you to reflect on someone you could extend your practice to. And so thinking about who that is. So how do we think about our impact in people's lives? How do we consider that our meditation practice is not just for us? I think when I began practicing, it might be even a kind of developmental stage in practice. Like I think for the first at least 10 years of practice, I didn't really think about it being for anybody else. I was just really wanted to feel safe in my own body and safe in the world, a sense of equanimity in myself and capacity to feel okay enough. And yet I kept reading these stories and hearing these teachings about these bodhisattvas, and I was like, well, what's their deal? Who are they about? What are they about? And there's these amazing stories of them. These very courageous beings who just were of service to other people. And there are kind of archetypal images of these people who are called like Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, where she, here in her name means to hear the cries of the world. And I know in these days, with COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter and just the glaring inequities in our world, to hear the cries to me is actually been such an important teaching. Just her name itself, this Bodhisattva, I find incredibly helpful. All right, my work and my practice is just to hear the cries, to let them be real. It's kind of like that image, right, of John Lewis, like actually receiving that image, the image of George Floyd. how important it is to hear it, to let it be real. How do we do that? How do we do that when we also want to close up? We want to contract from the world, or it feels overwhelming, which is so understandable. To feel overwhelmed and just can't, it's too much. Too much. And yet, how do we, there's a wonderful poet named Yehuda Amichai, who's an Israeli poet, and he talks about like the whole work is to open and close and open and close. You ever seen a moonflower? I don't know. How many of you have seen a moonflower? Nobody. A moonflower. You know, they're so beautiful. So I have a friend who has a moon garden. And so all the things in this little garden bloom at night. And so moonflowers are just the whole day, they're just like this big, long flower, but it looks almost like that they're dead. And you would never know their beauty unless you went out at night. And then they're like, whoa. They just open up into this huge, magnificent flower. And I feel like that we also have to appreciate that there are times when, you know, we might need a time where it's not expected for us to bloom. And I feel that in many ways, like this time is also the time of the moonflower, where in the darkness is when this big, magnificent, surprising bloom can happen. It can't happen in the daylight. It needs the darkness. It needs the moon. And so I think it's just so wonderful to really think about. I've been really enjoying thinking about things in many different ways instead of being sure about even my own experience. I find being really sure about my experience very limiting. And my opinions about what's happening are so limiting. I was watching a documentary the other day about people who are trans, and there was this amazing moment in the documentary where there was a reality show with, I think, Caitlyn Jenner, and anyway, she had this they had parents of trans kids on the show, and this one father was like, I can't believe that people would have an issue with this. You know, my kid is a unicorn. She is so amazing. She brings me awe in how much she knows herself from the inside out. He's like, I wish that I was that aware. And this actress was experiencing that, seeing that. And she talked about, well, first of all, her experience of coming out as trans to her parents was, you know, they kicked her out of the house and disowned her. And she said, you know, but my work now, I've realized after hearing that father, I realized that I've never spoken to myself in that way. I've never seen my own possibility of my own completeness in such a light. So it also reminds me of this kind of moonflower mind, right? Like in the darkest of times, the most magnificent flower can bloom. So I wanted just to briefly talk about, in our tradition, in the Soto Zen tradition, it's comes mostly from Japan and was founded around 775 years ago or so by a teacher named Eihei Dogen. And he was orphaned as a very young boy and decided to become a monk after his mother died. And he was so moved, but he was so curious about if we're already perfect and complete and lacking nothing, which is a kind of a fundamental Buddhist expression. Why in the world do we have to practice? It's so hard. Well, if we're already good, what's the deal, basically? And at that time in Japan, he went and studied with many, many people. And felt that none of them really could address that question. And so he went with one of his Dharma friends, and they crossed the Sea of Japan, which at that time, a long time ago, was quite perilous. But he really wanted to go because he heard that there were some Zen teachers in China at that time who were pretty interesting. So he went there and ended up finding his teacher named Rujing, which is a whole other story, which is totally interesting. But the main point is, like, he went against the grain, like what was offered or easily available to him. You could say in the sunlight of that time in Japan, it wasn't what he needed. So he had to go to China and risk his life to do that. And then he came back and brought those teachings back to Japan. And he did a very radical thing where he came back to Kyoto, which was the capital at that time, and started offering the teachings in Japanese, which doesn't sound radical, but at that time, to write, in particular, write in Japanese was not thought to be correct because it was more for the elite class, and he would write in Chinese. And so he was rather radical and not really popular, and kind of chased out of Kyoto and built his monastery in Fukui, which is in the western part of Japan. So, and he continued his whole life to write in Japanese because he felt that he wanted this practice to be available to everybody. And most people at that time did not appreciate that at all. So I think in some ways, I think it's just also to stay with this theme of the moonflower. I feel like it's very much kind of a moonflower quality. He was like, built this monastery that you can still go to. It's so beautiful. And it's basically an amazing part of Japan where the mountains are like almost like the little crevices in between the mountains. It's so beautiful. And the cedar trees. Oh, my goodness. But he talked about that Bodhisattva activity is really the essential part of our practice. What we do for others, our awakening practice. Right? And he talked about a few things. And the first one is giving, generosity. So it's really interesting in this time of COVID, and how can you be generous? And to me, sometimes that looks like a million different ways, but it's showing up sometimes for another Zoom meditation. I feel like oh, it's enough of the screen time. But who cares? It's like showing up also is a way of being generous, saying, I'm here too. I know many of us wish that we were in a different situation. And so it goes. But how do we give ourselves to the conditions of the time? For me, learning how to give myself to the conditions of the time is much more free than if I keep complaining that the conditions of the time are not meeting my needs. You ever do that? Where you're kind of like waiting for like the conditions of the time to meet your needs, and then it's okay. But Bodhisattva activity is about how do we give ourselves to the time that we're in and soften our clinging to how we want it to be. So that's one piece. And the second is kind speech. How are your words? Kind. But I also think about, someone in the chat reminded me of the name of the documentary called Disclosure. And it's kind of like that trans woman who, she realized like, oh my God, I've never really actually spoken those kind words even to myself. It was so poignant. And so how do we speak kind words both to ourselves and others? How do we watch even our thoughts? Dogen was really big on thoughts, words, and actions. And so how do we really consider even kindness in how we're thinking? It's so interesting to me to like really consider, how am I thinking right now? I don't know if you're a human being like myself, most of us think in a deeply repetitive way. 80% of our thoughts are the same way we think about things in general. So we interpret things most of the time the same way. And sometimes I tell a story because it's so amazing. So we live in an apartment building in a little island called Manhattan. And we have a neighbor who is so lovely, but every time you see this person in the elevator, no matter what you say, how are you? And she says, oh, it's too hot. Oh, and the next day, it's too cold, it's too rainy, it's too windy. It's like never the right moment. It's kind of like being locked into that story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears forever, right? Like where she's like, this one's not quite right, this is not quite right, this is not quite right. And it's kind of, to me, it's what Dogen's talking about, kind speech. It's like, it's not kind, mostly to herself. Like a nightmare. I asked her recently, how does that feel when, yesterday you were telling me this and today you're telling me that, and what's that like for you? And she said, it's awful. I said, I can imagine that. And so to me, it's also like a way for us to be generous with the people in our lives, to actually ask them real questions. To me, is also part of kind speech. And it was so interesting because she was so taken aback by my question. She's like, that was a very surprising question. And so it goes. how do we allow ourselves to extend, if we think about kind speech, in a different way? How do we think about it even as questions that are real questions? I often think of those questions also in particular about caring enough to ask, how are you? And pausing and being really curious how you are. How many people in your life do you feel that actually do that? Are actually curious how you actually are inside yourself? To me, it's a really poignant question. And to me, it was also a really important question to reflect on, and then also to ask myself, how am I that person for other people, or am I not? So it's really interesting to think about kind speech and think about it in kind of a different kind of way. And what are you offering to others in terms of just curiosity? What am I offering? Let's pause there for a moment. Moving to think about, how are we really participating in this life? And so Dogen goes from, giving from that mind of generosity to kind speech. And then he talks about beneficial action. So like, what are your actions actually doing? What are you doing with your body, with your resources? It's so interesting because I often think about, well, I care about certain things. And then another friend of mine, a Dharma friend, said, really? So how do you express that in the world? Cool. It was like so busted. It was so great because I actually find those kinds of relationships in my life, those kind of friendships and like good Dharma friends are so important. Who will like ask you those kind of questions, brave enough to ask us these questions. Do my actions really match up? Are they really beneficial? Or do we kind of say like, I care about this, or this is really what's most important, but not really do it? Interesting. And I find reflecting on that without a lot of judgment is pretty fun and very good, humbling practice. Not in a kind of a shaming way, but I think to have kind of a healthy embarrassment about how we're functioning. Because very often, as my husband would say, like, we think we're all that in a bag of chips. Like we think we're like we're so mindful, we're so compassionate, we're so caring, but like, are we really? It's really, I find it really fresh to consider. Suddenly like very dark in my room. It's very mysterious. Can you still see me? It got very like storm clouds have come into the little island here. So the last one that I want to talk about was no difference. So Bodhisattva activity starting with, this sense of generosity, kind speech and beneficial action, and then functioning with no difference. I think about my friend, my neighbor, who's like she's like, no matter what the difference is, she's like not pleased. But no, it's interesting because the day after we had that conversation, I saw her again in the elevator. It was actually obviously before COVID. I said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "Fine." This is her first time in 15 years she ever said that. I said, "Really?" And she said, "Really?" It was so interesting. I felt like actually she embodied in that moment that kind of non-difference, just like she's okay. It wasn't like she felt magnificent, she just was okay. So interesting. How do you do that? How do you practice with non-difference? What would that be like? What would it be like just to take on that as a practice, to think about, how could I bring in non-difference a bit more? To me, it's such good medicine for the kind of Goldilocks state, and what would it be like just to be like, okay, it's really dark suddenly. How interesting. To me, it's about non-differences. Instead of whatever is happening and having a strong opinion about it, because who cares really what our opinion's about in the big picture? How do we practice non-difference? How do we learn to be this moonflower and bloom in a magnificent way in a time of darkness and perhaps chance for great beauty? Thank you so much. I think we have time for some questions, and I have no sense that I'll have answers, but I'm happy to be in conversation with you.
So we have about 50, 60 people. Just so we don't talk over one another, why don't you just enter your questions into the chat or raise your hand if you want to speak directly, and I'll go ahead and call on you.
Great. Thank you so much. I would love to be in dialogue. It's much more interesting. I mean, what I have to say is okay.
Go ahead, Bridget.
Does by non-difference, is that the same as equanimity?
They're good friends. They're good friends.
I'm not sure I'm totally following you when you say non-different. So could you expand upon that concept a little bit?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And to me, it's about, someone told me the other day that, the coronavirus is evil. and we have to wipe it out. And I suddenly felt like this very protective of the little coronavirus, that little green round thing, which was surprising to me. I was like, leave it alone. Like, and I just realized that very often I could get into one view very easily and be sure that that's the view. And for me, non-difference is to realize, like, oh, right, it's almost like an attitude. Like, am I really sure that I have the right view? And my view is the right view. I don't remember if I shared this when I came there the last time, but I joined a white supremacist group, and I read it every morning a little bit, and I log on, and I have this experience of like, used to be like within like 100th of a second, but now it's maybe like 200ths of a second. I have like the same violent, aggressive, righteous feeling towards these people. And it's been such a teaching for me about difference. And I can be so sure that they're completely wrong and shouldn't exist even, because that's often their view. I mean, they're pretty radical. And I realize that it evokes the exact same feeling in myself, but the other side. And somehow I'm sure I'm right. And I feel like that happens throughout my day and throughout my life in more subtle expressions. And I feel like non-difference is like, they're like, oh, right, I'm like that too. So what I'm learning from being with them is that I can be that fundamentalist too, like that, no problem. Like, I don't have to practice it. I don't have to. And for me, like, to non-difference I'm working on compassion. And it's not that I feel like that what they're doing, that they should just like, prosper and like, bring their views everywhere. But I feel that there's some place in me I want to learn. It's also like coming from my own family history of Holocaust survivors and not survivors. And so like, I feel like that kind of intolerance in the world comes out of difference. And so practicing non-difference to realize like different circumstances, but I feel exactly the same, is a place where I feel like I can begin to love them as people and not approve of their actions and words. Perhaps. Working on it. I don't expect to ever be done working on it. I don't know if that helps.
We've got another question from Ron in San Diego. Go ahead, Ron.
Ron in San Diego.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I had been looking at your resume, and you indicate that you teach ethics and are associated with a medical center. And so I had a question regarding basically medical ethics. I was wondering how the Buddhist teachings really assist us with ethical issues that are associated with the care at the end of life. It seems to me that if you take a teaching like the Buddha's do not kill, if you interpret that in an absolute sense, it would really prevent using compassionate measures such as euthanasia, assisted suicide. So I was wondering, how do you approach advising persons regarding, say, the issue of assisted suicide for those that are terminally ill and that are interested in considering that particular option?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an important question. I would say that, well, first of all, we live in a world where, again, meeting the conditions of the world instead of how I want them to be. So depending on where you live, it's legal or illegal. And that's an important piece of it. And if you do this in a place where it's illegal, you can actually be in prison. So that's something to reflect on. And even, survivors of that person may actually often are arrested and put to jail. So whether I agree with that or not is not my point, but I think that's just an important aspect. And as Dogen talks about with ethics in general, it's time, degree, condition, and place. So I think that I've been on the ethics committee at a major hospital for more than 10 years, and most ethic cases, in my experience, are communication problems.
Oh.
That most people are not listening or don't know how to ask the right questions and actually be curious about what's happening inside of the person. And even if it's a family member or the medical team. And so I would say at least 98% of them are communication issues. And rarely, once you get people to be on the same page, it kind of actually goes back to the generosity that Dogen's talking about, and kind speech and beneficial action. It's like that. Oftentimes at end of life, things can get very fractious and people get very afraid, and that it feels like an emergency, but very often our experience is that death is not an emergency. And it's actually rather ordinary. And so coming in with a practice for me of Bodhisattva activity about, so let's listen to each other. I feel like in many ways, Dogen's guidelines are really helpful for what you're talking about, and have been definitely helpful for me, being on what seemed like on the outside, like very difficult ethical issues with families and different cultures and different, every family actually is filled with different cultures in themselves. And it's a mystery. And to me, the joy of the whole thing is actually being willing to listen and be really curious about how people came to their strong view.
Mm-hmm.
And what do they need as opposed to what do they want. And once you kind of can create some space for what people really need as opposed to what they want, you can have I've had so many humbling and amazing and inspiring conversations in the midst of what is thought to be an ethical dilemma. So it's like being in the midst of your life and having like really interesting conversations. And I feel like the more we can actually learn how to reach out to one another and have really caring conversations in general, then that will benefit those moments. But I feel like those moments are made more difficult at end of life because our whole lives we've never had real conversations, or in those families that have those issues. It's just challenging.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments. They've been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
We have another question from Andy.
Where are you, Andy?
I'm right here. Hey, how are you doing?
Hey.
You had mentioned healthy embarrassment when you were talking about kind speech. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and how does that influence that kind speech?
You know, I realized that, well, thank you. What does it say behind you, Andy? Does it gather?
It says gather, yes.
That's so cool. For me, having a healthy embarrassment, I think that there's a habit that we go into, like being ashamed or defensive about things. At least I've had that habit. I'll just speak for myself. And I never found that extremely helpful. I never found that to even be interesting. I would just like get really tight and uptight and want to hide somewhere. And what over time, what I learned is like just to have like what I like to call it healthy embarrassment, because I just feel like it's healthy to be embarrassed. It's so embarrassing because we're like such idiots sometimes, right? Like because we get so rigid. Speaking of myself, I can get so rigid and uptight, and it's so embarrassing. Like it's so crazy. Like what am I doing? You know, like, and you know, Ron was asking about end of life. Like after working with a lot of people at end of life, like no one is at the end of their lives saying like, I'm so glad I was so defensive my whole life. And, you know, like mostly people are like, what in the world was I doing? I was so afraid and so defended and so like boxed in my whole life. Like what was I doing? You know? And so to me, like having a healthy embarrassment is like, yeah, I'm an idiot or I'm an ass or whatever that is. Who isn't, you know? And I think that it's really so wonderful to just learn how to relax into that. We fall down, we're going to screw up, and we can stay in relationship and be like, I'm sorry, and learning how to be like, oh man, like, I don't know where I was, but now I'm back. And it's kind of like what I promise all of my students. I said, you know, I'm sure I'll disappoint you. And if I don't, then there's probably something wrong because we're not being real with each other. And at the same time, I'm committed to staying in relationship, and so that we can talk about it. You know, there's no fantasy of perfection. And so if we kind of soften our fantasy of perfection in myself, then I can be much more open and curious about you and actually be more with you than otherwise. But if I'm so into being right and perfect, and I really want you to like me, and I want to be a good, in my case, a good boy, like, ugh. Why not be more real instead of being good? I'm much more interested in being real than good.
I like that. I like that a lot. It's really just that statement and what you explained there is, it's given me this mind shift to be able to look at myself totally differently when I become in that uncomfortable place, because it happens, you know, to all of us. So thank you for that, because, wow, I mean, little mind shift right at this moment, epiphany almost, like, you know, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Koshin. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
We have one in the chat from Natalie. If we are able to separate anger from hate, can anger still be a valid, productive emotion?
But can you read it again?
Sure. If we are able to separate anger from hate, can anger still be a valid, productive emotion?
Totally. You know? Anger is so important. You know, think about John Lewis. Think about Rosa Parks. Think about Martin Luther King. Think about Dogen. I'm sure he was pissed. The Buddha was like, got to do something different. This way is not helpful. To be angry is such an exciting emotion too. And I think the big difference, I think that often it's a translation issue, is that when anger turns into resentment or hatred, then we're in trouble. Because that means we're like really locking into some story about it. As opposed to like, you know, when you did that, you really piss me off. It really makes me angry when you slurp your soup from your spoon like that. You know, you have to think about whatever you're like, these like little irritations that like become like hot. Right. And where Chodo and I like something like, did you scoop the litter tray? You know, it's like that kind of thing. Like that really pisses me off when you don't scoop the litter tray. You know, we joke about it, but it's actually these kinds of moments and learning how just to say it. Yeah, that pisses me off. And not for it to be such a big deal. Like, who cares? We piss each other off. That's okay. But it's like when we hold on to it because we feel like we're not supposed to say that because we're Buddhist or something like that. We're supposed to be like, you know, something else. I don't find that to be very helpful. To me, any kind of tradition that focuses on repression of emotions it's about how do you work with it, like, and how do you have some freedom around the feeling. I mean, to me, like that's where there's actually excitement and possibility. But when we kind of are trying to be a certain way, and anger is one of those things. Like anger and disgust are two of the 7 universal emotions that exist in every single culture. And I feel like we have such weird relationships to those things as opposed to just feeling them. Like some things are just disgusting. Like, so what? Or some things are just like so maddening. Okay. But like, if we don't have to get caught in the story, then we can just have the experience and do something new. And to me, like that's where the beneficial activity comes from. That's where the moonflower blooms, like where we think that it couldn't, like no way could the moonflower bloom in the night, you know, no way could the moonflower bloom in anger, no way could it bloom in disgust. But what if it can? You know, to me, it's so beautiful to imagine like what else, what can we really open to? So it's been a real joy to be with all of you. I hope that, you know, there's enough water in the Pacific to wash your ears out, my words. And that you find what's true for you. Who cares what I have to say? It doesn't really matter. What matters is really what's true for you. And it's a joy to be with you all. Thank you. Thank you. Be well, safe, wear a mask as a Bodhisattva activity. Wash your hands as a Bodhisattva activity. Who cares if you want to do it? Do it for others. So, be well, be safe.
Thank you, Koshin. From all of us and the crazy little Dharma Bum Temple in San Diego, we really just appreciate the love that you bring, and your very authentic, genuine self is really refreshing and wonderful. So Nice to see everybody, but again, a special thank you to you, Koshin, for joining us.
Thank you.
And you all be safe out there, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, brother.
Be well. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Tom, for a great job moderating.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff and Tom and everybody.